You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
What is tragedy apart from an absolute killer of a Bee Gees song? And if you don't know what I'm talking about, Google the Bee Gees tragedy. Disco is making a comeback, baby. But what can we learn from tragedy? Can we learn anything from tragedy? I really want to sing the song, but I won't, listeners, because we need to discuss tragedy in the context of war, strategic policy, and strategic frameworks. G'day, listeners, and welcome to the Dead Prussian podcast. I'm your host, the humblest host you know, the humblest host with the most, Mick, and thanks very much for supporting us on iTunes. It's worth noting we jumped 258 places up in the US iTunes ladder, which is great. We're still sitting at 426, so please keep that support coming so we can keep climbing the ladder. If all of our listeners do their best to get us into the top 100 in our category of news and politics in the US iTunes chart, I promise I will do something. I'm not sure what it is because I'm ad-libbing this as we go. Also, thanks to our new Patreon supporters. We've had some good support there, especially the changes to our new subscriber structure. It's just a one reward system now for our legends. It's a $5 monthly buy-in, and you get bonus content, and you'll have access to our transcripts once they're complete and we hit our fundraising goal. Now, I mentioned tragedy, not just the Bee Gees song in the intro, but the idea that tragedy can teach us something, and it can develop a way of seeing our future strategic challenges in a different light. But that's pretty much the extent of my knowledge on the topic. So I found someone who can tell me a little bit more about this. Now, Dr. Charles Edel is a senior fellow at the United States Study Centre, which is actually in a wonderful location in Sydney, Australia. Previously, he was Associate Professor of Strategy and Policy at the US Naval War College. We've got a few friends out there. Hi to those guys. And he served on the US Secretary of State's Policy Planning staff from 2015 to 2017. In that role, he advised Secretary of State John Kerry on political and security issues in the Asia-Pacific region, a region very close to our heart here in Australia. Charles worked at Peking University's Centre for International and Strategic Studies as a Henry Luce Scholar and was also awarded the Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellowship. He's the author of Nation Builder, John Quincy Adams and the Grand Strategy of the Republic. In addition to his scholarly publications, his writings have appeared in the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The American Interest, and various other outlets. And he's probably about to have a career highlight by appearing on this show. Charles holds a PhD in history from Yale University and received a BA in classics from Yale College. And most importantly, he's recently written a book with friend of the show, Hal Brand, and it is on tragedy. Charles, thanks for coming on the show.
Mick, thanks very much for having me on your terrific show, which is indeed a career highlight for me.
Listeners, he meant to say the career highlight, but yeah, thanks, Charles. It's good that finally, I guess, they're starting to recognise how lucky they are when they get invited on. Now, before we start discussing tragic sensibilities and policy development, I'm keen to learn about how you ended up with a career as a historian, specifically in the area of policy.
Well, a couple of different points, I think. First of all, from being a little kid, I've always been obsessed with American political history. And I was always very interested with the founding moment of the American Republic, because almost all of the American political debates, the strategic debates, are being scoped out there for the first time. How should a democratic state conduct its internal political development? How should it secure itself in a world that's pretty inimical to a small democratic state? So I've always been interested in American history, but that got married up to my love of classic history when I was an undergraduate in college. And I remember saying to my college advisor when he asked me what I wanted to write my college thesis on, I said, I want to do just what you do. And he said, oh, and I said, yeah, I'm going to take an ancient event and a modern event and put them side by side and talk about how they reflect on each other. And he laughed and said, "You can't do anything that obnoxious until you're at least 70 years old." So I followed his advice by half because I'm not anywhere near 70, but I've done that through my career.
It's good to do something obnoxious every now and then. I try to release an episode every month, and at least every month. And people tell me sometimes I'm quite obnoxious on the show. I don't necessarily believe them, but hey, that's how they get about it. Now, let's get into discussing some of that combination that your obnoxious combination. Let's call it that because no one else will. When we talk about tragic. We'll talk about the book first, I think. The Lessons of Tragedy that you co-authored with friend of the show, Hal Brands. Now, this is what this book does, right? Like, it draws lessons from, tragedy. Can you give the listeners a little bit of an overview without spoiling the book, because we still need them to go out there and buy it and support you as a writer? But can you give the listeners a little bit of an overview about the book?
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll make this a really short podcast, Mick, because it's only a 150-page book. Your readers really should go out and buy it and read it, because it won't take too long. No, but the argument of the book is really laid out in its title, The Lessons of Tragedy. And the argument that Hal and I wanted to put forward is that tragedy, and when we're talking tragedy, we're really talking about geopolitical tragedy, full-scale buckling of the international order, replete with great power war, mass suffering unfolding on a global scale, that it's more normal than we would like to think, and that we're closer to tragedy today than we might realize. But instead of starting the book with today, we actually go back to the ancient Greeks, to the birthplace of tragedy. And we use this as a framing device for the book. The idea that why do you have the Greeks, who are such a high-achieving culture, obsessed with the idea of tragedy? In some ways, they put it at the centerpiece, at the core of their civilization. And it was our belief and our argument that they did this to stare tragedy straight in the face, to understand collectively how bad things could spiral out of control. And it was only by keeping counsel with their worst fears that they could propel themselves as a community to take actions that they wouldn't normally take in order, hopefully, to stave off such a tragedy themselves. Now, we thought this was a pretty good way of thinking about tragedy, but it's not a particularly American way of thinking about tragedy, because most Americans tend to think that tragedy is something that is almost an impossibility. World War II is almost faded completely from memory. The Cold War is now 30 years old at this point. And so the memory of why you would take actions that were unnatural to prevent such a horrible thing from happening seem to have faded. And we argue that they faded at actually the worst possible time as the international environment has become more fraught. And the real argument of the book is that if tragedy is a real, awful, horrific experience for those who live through it, it actually can be a blessing for those who are willing to learn from it, because they prompt themselves as a community, even as a community of nations, to take actions that they wouldn't normally take. So the most stable international orders through most of history come right on the heels of full tragedies. And that's, we think, is a pretty good way of understanding where we're at, because we see that in many ways, the understanding of why America and its allies take the actions that they've taken for so long seem to be fading from memory right as this international environment is becoming more dangerous.
So, give tragedy the hairy eyeball, stare it straight in the face, and you might come out all right. It's interesting when we talk about tragic sensibilities. We're not just discussing this need for a box of tissues when watching a tearjerker. We're talking about drawing lessons from tragedy. You talk a little bit in the intro about your obnoxious pursuit of going back to the ancient Greeks. Now, Now how exactly did they use a tragic sensibility? You said that they learnt from it, but what sort of examples do we have of this?
So, two ways to think about this, Mick. I mean, one way is that, as I had already mentioned, I mean, tragedy was the core of their civilization. So every year, the entire Athenian community would gather on the hillside. It was a religious festival, so everyone was off from work. There'd be an awful lot of wine that you drink, and you'd go out and you'd watch the great and the good fall from positions of prominence to generally rather catastrophic ends. And they fell due to errors, due to ignorance, due to their own hubris. And the reason why they watched this all together was because it was a Greek insight that understanding tragedy was essential if you're going to avoid it. Looking directly at tragedy, understanding how quickly things could spiral out of control, the Athenians were prompting themselves as a community, as citizens, to have those conversations they need to have about what actions they were willing to take to make sure that they weren't on that path themselves. So that's why it was really the centerpiece of their culture, although it's kind of weird, because if you remember those Greek tragedies that you either read or skipped reading in grade school or at university, they're all kind of strange stories. I mean, the gods are always mucking about in human events, and they don't seemingly have anything to do with contemporary circumstances. But the playwrights, almost all of them were veterans themselves. Aeschylus had fought in the Persian Wars. These were directly meant to appeal to some of the largest themes that Athenian society was grappling with. And if you even think of the spectacle of tragedy, they would all come into the theater. The 10 strategos, the generals, would parade and sit right in the front. All the war orphans would come and sit right next to them. All the resident aliens and the envoys from various neighboring states would come and sit in places of honor so they could see the wealth of Athens. And then they would parade in all the kind of, the booty, the great gifts that they had gotten. So this is really a spectacle for Athenians to understand and take painful looks at some issues for confronting their own civilization. But, I actually think in your question, Mick, you were saying, well, how did they do this? And the thing is, they did this, right? They looked at this, but it didn't prevent them from going through their own tragedy, right? The Peloponnesian War happened in the midst of this. So this is not to say that just talking about this, just thinking about this means that you're going to avoid it. There are some other conditions. But it is necessary, we think, and that's the prompt really for this book, that a refusal to confront how bad things could spiral out of control, thinking that it's impossible, actually is at that precise moment when tragedy is more likely to strike.
It's interesting the timing of this interview as well, because tomorrow is Anzac Day in Australia. So, for our listeners listening to this, you're listening to me in the past. Not a strange concept because it's a recorded podcast, but which is national commemoration of a very tragic campaign. We haven't launched necessarily on the shores of Gallipoli since then, but the tragedy of 1915 didn't stop. Certainly, Australia entering the war when it came back in the late 1930s and 1940s. So I guess I can see when you say that we don't necessarily always learn from tragedy, even if we do remember it, like the Greeks, especially the Peloponnesian Wars. But if I have this correctly, the argument is that if we're conscious of tragedy, if we're identifying, observing, trying to learn from tragedy, then it can be used to, I'm going to use a budget word here, future-proof. It could be used to avoid future tragedy through examination. Is this kind of what you're getting at?
This is indeed what we're getting at, but there's a big but here. It depends what lessons you draw from tragedy. Because, it's interesting, Mick, you were just talking about Australia's experience in World War I, and then Australia had another experience in World War II, as did America. And of course,
Yeah.
In the book, we talk about giant bucklings of the international order. We talk about the 30 Years' War. We talk about the Napoleonic Wars. They raged for almost 25 years. We talk about, World War One. We talk about the Peloponnesian War. But in that final one, right, it's our point that the powers that come out of the wars don't want to relapse into what they had just gone through. So they're willing to set up configurations of power, be more forward deployed than the other words, be on guard for the signs that they might be tripping back into a great power competition. But World War One is the real exception, or really the interwar years, because of course the nations, the victors of World War One, are so scarred by what's happened that they draw a different set of conclusions. And the conclusions that they draw are that that was so awful that we can't possibly ever want to repeat such a step. And therefore, we won't necessarily arm ourselves, because we know that arms races lead to things like what happened in June, July of 1914. And we won't confront revisionist powers when they're on the march. And so the lessons that the interwar leaders draw from World War One are in some ways the exact opposite lessons that their successors draw after World War Two, because they look back at that exact same period and say it was the failure to stand up for democratic nations that were facing aggression from outside powers. It was the failure to not fight back against economic protectionism and trade wars. It was the failure not to stand up for democracy and democratic institutions, which in fact created global power vacuums and was an invitation to chaos. And in fact, the post-war order that is born out of that is drawn as a lesson drawn from the failures of that period. So if you think about all the relative successes of the post-war order, a relatively open economic system, a set of security alliances that were meant to deter aggression and promote stability, the advancement of global prosperity and democratic norms, those were all taken as a way to counteract what they saw was the failure to learn the correct lesson after World War One.
And that's a great example, because it's, I guess, with the centenary of the First World War just closing now, it's such a very relatable era and issue. And you and Hal apply the ancient understanding of applying lessons of tragedy, keeping tragedy in mind to modern strategic policy. And I'm not talking about the First World War here. I'm talking, particularly that of what confronts the US at the moment. Now, how exactly could a great power such as the US use a tragic sensibility to develop its strategic policy frameworks to meet future challenges?
Yeah. Well, first of all, look, this book in some ways was written for an American audience. Both Hal and I are Americans, but it's not just for Americans. And in fact, I would say it's for almost all democratic states who have prospered, who have done well out of this post-war order. So that very much includes Australia at the forefront of things. And kind of two answers to your question, Mick. So the first is, and I alluded to this earlier, that as the historical memory grows from truly tragic events, as the memories fade, the logic of doing what you have done seems to make less sense, because the idea that a great power conflict could return, a real great power war could actually be getting closer to us, seems to many people like it's an impossibility. Again, 75 years since World War II, 30 years since the end of the Cold War. And so the logic of America's forward engaged position in the world, there are questions that have always been around that always have to be answered. Americans, and we see this in American political debates today too, and we go into this a decent amount, there are some natural questions, such as, why does America have alliances all over the world? Why should Americans care about faraway places like Ukraine and South China Sea? Why should America keep its markets open to countries that don't keep their markets open to American goods, particularly when it comes at the expense of American workers? And there are answers to all these questions, and they're historical ones, because the answer is the 20th century. The answer is, when America has not played such an anchoring role for the system, terrible things tend to happen. But again, as we have grown the distance from that, the logic, the preventative logic of why America and its allies have done those things seems to make less and less sense. And as we said, it's making less sense at just the wrong time, when you have revisionist powers, China and Russia, kind of probing at the kind of outer limits of American power. Democracies are in recession while authoritarians charge forward. There's a greater number of challenges that we're dealing with than before. And so your question, I will come back to it, Mick. Sorry if I wandered off.
That's all right. The listeners can pause you if they need to.
Well, the question is, what can we do about it? On the one hand, and obviously you're speaking to the right person on this, read history, right? I was chatting with an audience the other day, and someone said, well, aren't you guys just a bunch of, old historians who just say you've never had it so good and you just need a war to kind of teach the young people? That's like an old person's message. And I said, one, I didn't know I was that old, but okay. But two, in answer to your question, yeah, of course you need a war to teach you that you've not had it so good. But wouldn't you rather read about one than experiencing one? That's pretty obvious. I do think a lot of President Obama had this beautiful question that he posed, where he said, if you had to close your eyes and pick any time in history to live, it would undoubtedly be today. We're safer, we're wealthier, we're healthier than ever before. I think he was right. But that doesn't negate the fact that the foundations of the order are being eroded as we speak. And so what can we do about this? Well, one is to realize that tragedy, real bucklings of the international order, are as much the norm as they are the exception. And that this idea of tragedy and what revisionist powers are doing, it's coming back and it's stalking current events once again. But I think perhaps the most important lesson to draw out of this is this book is, it's not a ray of sunshine, as the lessons of tragedy might imply. It's meant to shock people a little bit, to not be so complacent. But you have to avoid complacency without falling into the trap of fatalism. And I think that there's an awful lot that Australia, that America can do together and on our own and with our other friends. I think we actually have the resources in our capacity to handle almost all the challenges we have in front of us. The question is if we are willing to do that or not.
And I just want to make it very clear to our listeners that the lessons of tragedy is a heartwarming tale of hope. But I like your idea that it's probably easier to read about a war than fight one. Actually, I think that's a good bumper sticker. Now we're gonna duck to our subscriber question, just because, well, they pay me money, so I owe them something a little bit extra. So for the other listeners, you're not going to notice anything except for a slight pause. All right, and we're back for those cheapskate listeners who don't subscribe to the bonus questions. Let me tell you, it was an absolute cracker. And as I just told Charles, I would have bet my microphone that he answered in a completely different way to the way he did. So he got me there, which means I get to get him now with the final question on the show that every guest gets to answer. And given that we're in episode 70-something or other now, it's getting quite tough for people to come up with original answers to this question. So, Charles, you probably know that the final question is one I ask of all guests. It relates to our mission on the show to define war in as many ways as possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself, and continue one of the most important debates on how blood and treasure are spent across the world in the pursuit of political will. Now, I asked each guest to finish the sentence, war is. So right now, I'm going to ask you to finish the sentence. War is.
Not what Carl would have you think it is. In fact, I would draw off of his ancient cousin Sun Tzu, that war is an issue of vital concern for the state. And it doesn't only occur during wartime.
Well, for those listeners that listen to the bonus question, that's a great tie into the bonus question, and that is also a very original answer.
Oh, did I do it, Mick?
Yeah, you did. But it's the first time anyone speculated that Sun Tzu and Big Carl were actual cousins, which just based on my timeline and the likelihood that Sun Tzu didn't even exist is probably not realistic. But hey, guys, we'll let Charles live with his belief that Carl and Sun Tzu were blood relations, because that's how I interpreted your answer. Look, Charles, thanks very much for coming on the show. It's been great having you on the show.
It's been a real honor, especially during and right before Anzac Day. So thank you very much, Mick.
And listeners, please go out and grab yourself a copy of The Lessons of Tragedy. Now, I've got some links in the show notes, and they'll also be putting out some links on Twitter for you to grab the book. You'll note that the links we put out will be through our associates program with Amazon. So we therefore get a little bit of a kickback on the show in terms of a commission on any sales of those books. Don't worry, the money won't come out of Charles or Hal's pockets, although I would love to steal from those gentlemen. It will be a kickback Amazon provides us for encouraging you to use their services, which, now that Australian listeners also have Amazon here in Australia in terms of a domestic warehouse facility and reduced postage, it's actually quite good deal for us. So we have moved over to Amazon for all those listeners that have used our previous arrangements in the past. Jump on board, keep buying books through us and keep us on the air. But most importantly, support Charles. You can also support Charles by engaging with him on our favorite platform for chatting, Twitter. So engage with Charles at Charles Edel, and that is Charles spelt like the Prince, and Edel. And you should know that if you look at the podcast notes. Jump on there and ask him about tragedy. Also, the Legends program, as I said at the start of the show, we are down to one single reward scheme so that we can give a better service to all of our subscribers. That is a $5 a month. You'll get the bonus content, exclusive content, and you'll also get access to the transcripts once we hit our goal and they are released. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.